After e4, c6, knight c3, d5, and knight f3, we're gonna go through in this video. We're gonna go through pawn takes, knight takes, and well, in the previous video we went through bishop f5. Now we're gonna go through knight f6. It's a very popular move. It's played at the very top level. So now we need to take the knight. This knight can be taken in two different ways, either with the e-pawn or g-pawn. We're going to go through both ways. Let's start with e-pawn takes. Now we need to immediately play d4. This is a great place for this pawn to be. Of course, we don't have any pawn in the center, and so of course we're going to put pawn in d4, and it stops black idea from to knight d7 and knight d5. And also it allows both bishops to go out as soon as possible. Now we're going to go through these options. We're going to go through bishop e6, bishop g4, and bishop d6. Those are the ones that make sense. Let's start from bishop e6. Although more often than not, even after, you know, sometimes in these kind of positions, even with the different order of moves, the setup is going to be the same eventually, just with the different order. Now we play bishop d3. Right, so that's how we're going to be playing, because we know that the black player is going to castle the king side. He's not going to castle queen side because white has a majority of pawns on the queen side and black only has 3 pawns and we have 4, and we're going to be storming these pawns as we've seen a few patterns in the previous videos as well. Also, there's this c6 pawn move, and we do have the dark square bishop, so the dark square diagonal is going to be threatening. We still have a queen on the board, so castling this side, queen side, will be really bad for the black player. So after bishop d3, bishop d6, we castle and black castle, and we reach this position. So now there's a very simple plan. The plan is c4. The plan is queen to c2, going for this diagonal. And so let's keep a few moves, right? Let's pretend we're gonna do things properly, of course, but let's pretend that we get to play again. The idea now is to play queen c2, and of course there's an attack on h7. How can this be blocked? It can be blocked with g6 or h6. f5 no, because we can just take it for free. It's a free pawn. Let's see, for example, g6. Now the plan is this: we have rook e1, and after c5 we have a sacrifice on the bishop. So after c5 the bishop goes back, and then we do have a sacrifice here. Pawn takes back, and now we play bishop to h6. The idea is to sacrifice the bishop in g6. Pawn takes, queen takes back, and so of course now you'll be wondering, of course we don't get to play 2 moves in a row on 2 separate occasions. Yeah, but that's how the plan looks like. And this, talking about it like this, explaining it and starting it myself, helped me memorize what to do against each opening that I'm going through in my videos, much better than memorizing lines without knowing what I was doing, and like especially knowing the reason why I played a specific move. So for example, it wouldn't have been enough for me to just say that the move to play was c4. I needed to understand that the move c4 comes with the release of the c2 square available for the queen. So that's why I decided to go a move ahead. Now after the bishop h6 move, and the rook gets saved, maybe protects the g7 square a little bit more. We still have bishops g6, and then pawn takes back, and then we have a check. And after king h8, we're going to take the rook. And after taking the rook here, we have a checkmate threat. If black moves the queen somewhere close, then we can just take this bishop as well, and we're winning the material. And if queen goes to d7, defended by the knight, then queen f6, check. And king h8 only move because this leads to the knight coming in the attack. But anyway, king here, and this is something like mate in 11 moves. Besides, we have like so much more material. White has also 3 more pawns, and yeah. So let's go back. So here we are at the starting position. So black just played bishop e6, we play bishop d3, and after the development of both bishops in the 6th rank, we castle, black castles, and we play c4. So now we know what we're going for. We're going for queen c2. So that's why sometimes I skip a move for the opponent, so that we know what we're doing, because that's going to help memorization of the plan so much better than just memorizing what move came after what move, because that's actually not the right way to memorize the plans. So after c4, now it's black to move, and chances are we're just going to go for this plan anyway, because what can black do? Whatever black does, we're still going to do that. One weird move I've encountered sometimes is c5, but white still does this. So let's just not play this move and just play another move that is considered actually good. Rook to e8, right? So rook on an open file. That's the move we're going to go for as black. So queen c2, and now let's look at this defense, g6. We're going to go also through a6. So now white continues with bishop e3, developing the last bishop and connecting the rooks. Black develops the knight. Knight e7 is not really brilliant because the knight has no future, right? So knight c5 is not possible, knight e5 is not possible, knight b6 is met by a fork like this. So knight b6 will be met by c5. So the knight's best move now for the black player is knight e6. The idea is to reach this square and fork these two. So after knight a6, needless to say, a3 is the best move because the only move that makes sense. We need to keep both the bishop pair and the queen alive. So let's look at the black player now. His position is completely paralyzed. The bishop cannot move to anywhere, right? In each square it will be taken. The knight cannot move anywhere. The queen cannot move anywhere without causing some damage. Well, maybe queen a5 would be possible, but that will just help white to advance the b4 pawn and go for the pawn storm that we're going to be doing anyway because we have a majority of pawns here on the queen side against the minority. So black's move now is black's best move is considered bishop g4 because it's trying to take the knight and smash things around the opponent king side. I mean our king side. So after bishop g4 hitting the knight, we play bishop back to e2. There's nothing to worry about having gone to d3 and then e2. It looks like we wasted the tempo, but so did black. In fact, bishop e6 was not as good as bishop g4 to start with. And the thing is, we're going to play h3. And after playing h3, either the bishop will swap for our bishop and we go on to play with the two bishops, or the bishop will go back, and when it goes back, then we can place our bishop back in d3, and we don't have to worry about the black bishop going to g4 anymore because we will have a pawn in h3. So the idea here that I'm taking into account is the fact that black has a double pawn here. Black could try some idea like f5, f4 with the support of the bishop. So for example, now f5. And after h3, now black is forced to take. So this plan of the f5 pawn, which is doubled up, will force black to give up the bishop pair. So bishop takes, and now f4. And now we have to remove the bishop. We're going through this plan now, but we're going to go through other plans as well, of course. So right now we have the bishop pair, and we're going to be claiming the open file with rook, and we're going to be doubling up the rooks. And we're getting ready for our usual storm of pawn storm. So let's look at some ideas. So let's say black will have to remaneuver the knight. So knight to c6 and potentially knight to e6, attacking some better squares instead of the initial plan, which wasn't possible. After knight to d7, as we said, there was nowhere to go. So after knight to c7, we play rook a to e1, very natural move. How are we going to be acting against this king? It has to be remembered that when black that plays this specific line of the Caro-Kann goes for this release of the double f pawn and pushes this pawn, then we're going to play a move like bishop to c3, right? That's typical. This bishop has no future on this diagonal. Now it's black to move. Let's say a move like queen f6, for example. To develop the queen, connect the rooks and hit on this pawn, we're going to play bishop c3. And the plan is going to be d5 and gain control over the dark squares. After a move like rook to c8, for example, knowing that there's going to be a swap of pawns here and the black player wants to play the rook on the same file of the queen. After d5 and a move like queen g5, for example, then we are winning this pawn. So that's going to be too late for black. So let's just go on a few moves like pawn takes, and then queen d2 attacking the bishop. And now the bishop will have to move. After the bishop moves, let's say e7, we've got this idea. And now the only way to stop it is going to be with f6. Well, of course, bishop f6 or something is not possible because we got two pieces attacking f6. So after f6, we play queen d7. We've got double attack on this bishop, but the bishop can't move because we'll take this rook. The rook can't move because we'll take this bishop. Well, this rook can't move because we'll take this knight. So just a few moves ago, after the knight went to c7 and we play rook a to e1. After a move like queen f6 and we play bishop c3, then that's the plan we're going to go through. So after rook c8, d5, and then the queen has to move again. Then we take a pawn. And after queen d2, earlier we were attacking the bishop. What happens after a move like queen d8? Play as solid as possible. We're going to take this pawn. So as I mentioned before, we won a pawn at the very least. So let's see what happens after black playing the best moves. Here the position is completely won, but rook e1, and now after the best move, bishop c5, white plays something like white plays bishop d7, and after the rook moves, white plays b4. So the reason why, even in this position, which is, I mean, we're a pawn up and we have the bishop pair, so we're winning, but instead of cutting the line off, I've decided to continue it just to see how an attack is typically done. In this case, we have a majority, and we had a majority before already, right? We have 3 against 1 now, and we're going to be pushing these pawns. So after the bishop moves, let's say back to f8, in order to give some more defense to the dark squares near in his own king side. Now white plays queen to d4, and bishop g7 is not possible, so that's an excellent type of move. So after a move like f6, we play the rook on the same file of the queen, and we carry on. Now the position is even more winning. Queen e7, for instance, then queen f4, and we're going to stop it there. So going back a few moves, here we're trying this plan of the black player pushing the f4 pawn, and earlier we went through a move like queen f6. What happens if black develops this queen to g5 with the same idea of connecting the rooks and developing the queen? Well, the plan remains pretty similar, except this time the queen is not in f6. So if nothing's attacking the square in d4, then white can just play queen b3 and target the usual weakness, one of the usual weaknesses of the Caro-Kann, so especially since the light square bishop is gone. So queen to b3, black can try knight e6, giving up the b7 pawn for the d4 pawn. Well, we go on with the same plan. So bishop c3, it's always going to be like this. Especially here we're talking about specifically when black plays g6 and the idea of pushing the f pawn, which by the way is not going anywhere. So now bishop c3 protects the pawn and we're still threatening this. So after rook b8 now, white continues with queen d1. The idea is d5 and then attacking the knight, and then afterwards we have the usual ideas of going to the dark squares with the queen and the support of the bishop. The best move by black, well, black is paralyzed, right? He can't really move anywhere and he's got no moves. b5 will be followed by bishop c6 with an attack on the rook, so that doesn't work. The best move according to the engine is h5. And by the way, for the last moves in each one of these scenarios that we're looking at, white has always been up in evaluation something like +3 to +4, right, because of this paralyzation of the black's pieces. So after h5, d5 comes with an attack on the knight. After pawn takes, we take with the bishop. Of course, we need to keep this majority like this. We're not going to take with the pawn and then have a 2 against 2. We're going to keep the 3 pawns like this, because then we're going to play b4, c5, and so on. Now we have a threat of taking the knight, and then after black takes, we can swap everything and then take the bishop. So after rook goes on the same file of the queen, the only move that makes sense, white can still take the knight. And now whether the rook takes or the pawn takes, we're still going to play queen to d4. So let's say rook here, then queen to d4 is deadly. There's no way to stop this, well, unless f6, but then white loses the rook, and the rook cannot take this rook because of the checkmate. The bishop can't move because we can just take it with the rook. It will be up material. So in the same position, if the pawn takes, queen to d4, and now e5. So that was a slightly better move. Pawn takes in order to play e5. Now the queen goes to e5, gives a check, and the best move by black is king to h7. And now we can take this pawn with a check. It's not poisoned because after rook to e7, protecting the king, protecting also the pawn in a7, being supported by the queen and by the bishop, the white queen goes back to e4. And this majority here is going to be the winner of the game. Let's recap. e4, c6, and then the knights, the 2 knights. Pawn takes, we take back. Knight f6 is taken by the knight. Pawn takes back, and now we have to play d4. The idea is to quickly play the bishop to d3. After bishop e6, bishop d3, and the 2 bishop here in the 6th rank, we castle and reach this position. So now what's the move? c4. We're going to play queen c2. So after rook to e8, going on an open file, the rook is never going to stay in f8. There's no variation where the rook stays in f8. In this game, the rook will go here, also because that would allow, just one of the reasons is that the bishop will be able to go to f8, potentially due to the weakening of the dark squares, and play maybe a fianchetto. Well, anyway, rook e8, and now we play queen c2. So earlier we went through a little bit of scenarios of what happens after g6, and the whole idea of pushing the f-pawns. In this case, we're going to go through the idea of h6 to stop the white from just winning the pawn. So now there's no point in going to h7, of course. So the idea now is bishop d2. The plan is pretty much it's very similar. Bishop to c3, and just put the rooks on an open files and keep the majority of pawns here so we can storm them later. And also one thing that has to be remembered in this case is that the queen and the bishop will be controlling the light squares, and because black didn't play g6, which helps control these 2 squares, f5 and h5, then in that case we will be able to play knight to h4. Knight to h4 will be excellent because, well, in this case the black pawn will be too late in playing g6, simply because then we will take this pawn and that's just going to be horrible for black. So the idea of going with the knight to h4 eventually, maybe, I mean not right now, but eventually that's an idea. The knight will be able to go to f5. If the bishop were to take, then we take it back and we win the bishop pair, and we're much better. And if the bishop were not to take us, then there's going to be lots of ideas, especially because these squares will become very weak and some tactics will appear. So after h6 and white plays bishop to d2, black to move. So let's look at this idea, queen to c7 in this case, right? There will be no sense in going queen to e7 because of rook f to e1 with the idea of pushing the pawn to d5. It would be a nightmare. So also it makes sense to put the queen and the bishop on the same diagonal, putting more pressure on h2, stopping the knight from going to h5 to h4 as well in case. Now we play rook f to e1, and now earlier we went through this idea, the knight a6. Just feel free to play a3, and this knight is going to be completely misplaced. It's just a useless piece. Knight just doesn't move. So let's look at this though. Knight to d7. Black's position is actually not very good right now, and now the white's move is going to be g3. It makes sense if you think about it. Yeah, this is not a problem. Bishop g4 is not a problem. We could just move the knight. And this g3 move, first of all, helps control a little bit further the dark squares, and also does not allow black to go for h2, so it does give us the freedom to play knight h4 if we wanted to. And also it prepares the king for the advance and get ready for the endgame whenever the pieces will be swapped. So let's make an example. Bishop g4 would be met by knight h4, and g5 would be met by knight f5. With the usual idea, we don't have to worry about this diagonal, and if we get taken, then yes, then we win the bishop pair, we're just better. Knight h4, and now, so you might be wondering, okay, knight a6 was completely wrong because the knight is misplaced, but knight d7, at the beginning of the video, we mentioned how the knight cannot go to b6 because it gets forked, and also these two squares, there's no access because of the control of the d4 pawn. Well, the idea of going to knight d7 is that the knight could try to go to f8, and then get into the game to potential squares. Well, definitely e6 would be better than g6. So let's try knight f8. Let's try this idea. Our duty is to claim full control over the light squares by playing bishop f5. So we're threatening to win the bishop, and then we're forcing him to swap. Well, what happens if the bishop refuses to swap and goes to h5? Then simple idea is c5. Where can the dark square bishop go? Nowhere. He's going to go to e7, only move. And well, if the rook were to swap us first, then we will swap and we will be even better. So after bishop e6, we can now play g4. g4 was not possible when the bishop was in d6, because then the bishop will be taking this pawn, and that would be very bad for white. So after bishop is forced to e7, g4, bishop goes back, and now we're going to take it with the knight, and we won the bishop pair. What happens if the knight takes? Then we can take back with the queen, with the bishop, and then queen takes back, and we are threatening this move. We'll be winning one more pawn. It's completely lost position. And after taking the bishop here, what happens if black takes with the pawn? Well, the exact same thing. We just take the pawn here for free, and we carry on in this very pleasant position. There's an attack on the rook right now. Well, if the knight takes the bishop, we just take back, and we do the exact same thing we did before. We're going to win the h6 pawn as well. Yeah, let's just have fun. After this move, attacking let's look at another scenario. Let's say the rook moves, then we have a check in c4, right? It can only be, well, it cannot be blocked with the rook here because the rook will be pinned, and then we're going to play bishop e4, and then we win the rook. If king just moves here, we go on with the unstoppable plan, bishop to f5, and this black bishop cannot move anywhere. And after this move, well, right now white's got a huge advantage. And the idea is to play rook e2 and then double up the rooks and go for this bishop, infiltrating the rooks. The position is completely lost. It's evaluated like something +7. So let's go back a few moves. Right after playing the g3 maneuver and the knight to h4, we went for this plan, bishop f5, with the idea of is claiming the control of the light squares. What happens when the bishop takes? Then we take back with the knife f5. And now we've got so many pieces aiming at the opponent king's side. We don't have a win right now, we just have to consolidate the advantage. Let's just always remember that white will be happy to swap everything right now if it were possible, simply because we have a majority of pawns. Yeah, black has a majority on the king's side, but the pawn is doubled up. So what can black do right now? Well, taking the rook will be silly, because then we will take back, and then black will not have a chance to play rook e8 again. And so we will claim control of the open file, especially after a move like c5 and the bishop having to go back, then we will just take it. So rook e1 is never going to be possible. Knight will not go to d7, that's where he went, that's where he came from. He went to f8, right, because he wanted to move to e6 or g6. So let's see something like knight e6. White continues with rook to d1. And now let's just quickly look at two different lines, two different ideas basically. The idea of playing pawn to b5, this is possible actually. They've played it sometimes. The idea is basically to isolate the d pawn. So we best move now is to take. Then after takes back, we have a equal pawn, so we don't have a majority anymore because this pawn is isolated. This pawn in d4 here is isolated. So after take, we can still swap. And now, of course, the bishop has to take back because otherwise the knight will take the bishop. Bishop takes back, and now d5. So now we have a passed pawn. So that idea failed, basically. Well, let's see how quickly to continue this. Well, the knight will have to move, let's say, knight to g5. And now, as I mentioned earlier, we are really happy to swap everything. Rook e8, rook e8, and now we just carry on with pawn to d6. Right, so that was a passed pawn. So the idea that the black player might have to fight against this problem of the minority of the queen side against the white majority loses, because then this pawn is isolated, but you know, we have an isolated pawn, but it's also a passed pawn, and if he can advance by making threats, it's going to be winning a lot of tempos. Let's back a few moves. Earlier we went through this idea of the black player forcing white to play b5 and try to mess up with our pawn structure, but again we're just fine with this d4 isolated pawn. We're just fine. So let's look at another idea. What happens after queen to d7, for instance? Right, just a random move so that we can talk about the next moves. We play bishop c3. So it really is a thing, this bishop c3 move. Bishop d2, bishop c3. Needless to say, in this variation of the Caro-Kann, the bishop just rarely goes on this diagonal. Anyway, let's talk about the idea. Now that we have this knight in f5, we have a lot of pressure on g7, h6, and the idea here is to push the pawn. So as you notice, all of the patterns seems to be always the same, right? Of course they are, because it's the same setup, right? That's the same game we're playing. We're playing against the Caro-Kann, the knight f6 variation. This bishop is willing to go to f6 soon, right? This knight will be able to go to h6. Well, depending on what black does, there's the infiltration of the queen. There's going to be tactics. So let's say after a move like queen d7 and bishop c3. So to better illustrate this plan, let's make a random move for black, right? Let's say bishop to c7. White carries on with ideas like h4. Like h4, by the way, also because it that's a good move, h4, because it stops the knight from going to g5 and potentially f3. You know, the knight would be well placed in g5, so h4 is important. Then the idea is to play d5, making this bishop better, and the knight in f5 here, that's when he starts actually getting into the game. Let's remember that g6 was never possible because of knight takes pawn with check. So after d5, something like pawn takes and rook takes. So now, you know, the queen will have to move, where let's say queen to c8, getting out of the way. The unstoppable plan goes with queen to d1, and queen to d1 granting access to the g4 square, and bishop sacrificing f6. All of this will be possible. Queen to d1 reaching potentially the square g4, bishop f6 sacrifice, that would be absolutely possible, and white enjoys this just much better position. So let's make a very quick recap. So the pawn takes and the knight takes, and then the knight f6, we take it. So our opponent decided to take with the e pawn, we play d4. And after both bishops are gone into the 6th rank, we both castle. The plan now is c4, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this, and then this. So after c4, and black plays rook to e8, getting the rook out of the double getting the rook out of the double pawn, queen to c2, and we're looking at the h6 move. So play bishop to d2, queen to c7, or whatever else. We're still going to play a move like rook f to e1, and with the knight going to the action like knight to d7, knight f8, knight to either g6 or e6, with this idea we're going to have to play g3. So let's remember, when we see this queen and bishop together, let's just play g3 and get out of trouble, and let's claim control of the light squares with knight h4. So bishop g4 is not a problem, knight h4, knight f8 in this variation, and this is how we claim control of the light squares. Bishop, bishop, knight takes back, knight e6, and now we put the rooks on the... So you see, as you can see, we're not even that far from the opening. All these moves are basically forced. Let's go... Earlier we went through a move like queen d7, right? Just to make an example, to see how the plan will go on. We play bishop to c3, and earlier we went through just a random move to see how the plan will look like, bishop to c7, which is bad because we're just going to play h4, d5, and so on. Let's look at the best move. That is basically bishop to f8. This will help protect the weak targeted dark squares in front of the king, and also g6 would be possible because then the knight will not be able to take h6 because of the bishop, and this bishop, instead of going to a square where it's going to be kind of far from the action, especially considering that the dark squares on the white king side are strong, this bishop is now going into the defensive mode. Right, now we're going to play h4, right? So h4 and d5 are happening no matter what, because we really don't want the knight to go to g5. So, okay, so h4. After h4, let's see, can black play g6, for example? Well, okay, let's look at this idea. We cannot, as mentioned, we cannot play knight to h6, since it's protected by the bishop. We're going to play knight to e3. The knight here is just fine, and we're still threatening d5. So that's what we're going to go through next. And the funny thing is that d5 is going to happen no matter what. So the best move for black right now is knight to g7. This has many purposes. Queen has got much more freedom. Rook is on an open file, and the knight is threatening to go to h5. And the idea of the black player here is to play h5 and then f5, f4, and try to dismantle a little bit of the king side here. So that's the plan that black will go through, and also the plan we kind of discussed. It was not the same thing, but we kind of discussed it at the beginning of the video. So this idea of the f pawns, although this is it's in a different scenario, but the setup is very similar. So after knight to back to g7, the best move by black, white continues with d5. So here we are creating a passed pawn potentially. If black takes, we can take back with the rook, comes with an attack on the queen, and we can double up the rooks. We're just so much better here. The idea here for the black player could be, in order to delay the best option by the black player is not to take the pawn, in order to delay the advance of this pawn majority. So basically, if we were to take this pawn, and we should do it at some point, the queen will take back, and yes, we still have a majority. We have 3 against 2, but these 2 pawns are very backwards, and we're gonna have to start a slow attack. Now, best move by black is knight to h5. This is basically what happens after this line here. This very last line that I've kept for the end of this video is basically black playing the absolute best moves. The idea again is to play the f pawn, to go down with the f pawn. We can take this pawn. Now the queen will have to move away from the attack of the rook, so queen c6 is the only move here. And now white plays queen to d3. The position is way superior for white, right? White is just fine. Let's just remember that that this idea of queen d4 together with the bishop is always going to be available, and if black were to push this pawn, we'd still have that sort of idea, and a move like f6 will allow us to favor a swap of queens. So if black pushes these pawns a little bit too much and allows our queen to go and give a swap with the queens, because we have a majority of pawns here, we are happy to swap pieces, and we're also happy because our rooks are more active. We're going to put the rooks on the 7th rank. And so, well, anyway, after queen to d3, white has got such a dominant position. The black knight is misplaced. This bishop will not have many squares to move to, because here we always have the idea of a3, b4, c5, and so on. So let's just quickly mention the fun variation. If black were to play rook a to d8, then we could just take. Our position is so dominant that we could just take. So now we've got 2 rooks for the queen, which is all right. But in this case, we have the threat of playing knight to d5, rook to e8 here. The bishop would be paid. The knight will be putting pressure on f6 together with the bishop. So what can black do? Well, a move like king to g6, the king to g7 is met by knight to d5. Nothing is stopping this rook from going to e8 and threatening rook to g8, rook to h8, the other rook following with a checkmate. If the bishop were to go, then we will have the infiltration of the rooks. If instead the black player doesn't play king to g7 but plays queen to b6 with an attack of the rook, we're going to play rook to a8 very quietly, and the bishop is still pinned. The ideas are going to be the same. Knight d5 is coming this time with a tempo, and the rooks are coming this way. Well, now the black player will have to move. If white can move again, this will be the move, right? Queen to d5, queen going to d6 will be met by bishop to f4, winning the game. Queen c6 will be met by this check, winning the game because the bishop is pinned. And well, it's black to move now after the best move, which is queen c5. We're still going to play b4. So the moves are going to be very relatable each time, right? We are always going to be pushing these pawns against the Caro-Kann. So here we are back at the last position. Just mentioning the very last thing. If black doesn't play rook a to d8 in this position, so let's look at the very best moves. the absolute best moves that black can play. Well, black's best move is f5, as mentioned before. That's the whole point of going to h5 with the knight, so you can play f4. So after this move, white continues with knight d5. So very similar pattern as usual. The plan is to play pawn to b4, b5, a4, a5, oops, a5, and so on. So the best move by black right now is a6, because b4 coming will be just too much to handle, especially a4 as well, and then b5. We do have a majority, and when you have a majority against a minority, the majority will always win. So 3 pawns against 2, 1 pawn will be a queen. So a6 is the best move by black. And now white continues with a4. Needless to say, the queen cannot capture this pawn because knight b6 wins the game. So a4 is threatening b4. And now the best move by black according to the engine, also because black has got no moves. G5, you can just, this pawn will fall eventually. This h pawn can't move. F6 pawn would be really bad. No, this pawn cannot try an advance. And well, the best move by black is, well, for the very simple reason that the queen wants to take the pawn in a4, rook takes. The idea is that after rook takes, now black is offering another swap, because then the queen will be able to take this pawn. But still, like in a scenario where we're swapping all these pieces, we can just take, and after queen takes back, we're gonna play a5. So how do we win this game? We have a majority here. How do we consolidate our advantage? Well, we're just gonna keep dominating the position. We still have the idea of playing b4. According to the engine, black's best move now is bishop to g7, which is favoring the swaps. But that is also because the queen wanted to go to d4 anyway. If black allows the queen to go to d4 with the threat of checkmate in h8, then bishop g7 doesn't really work, because we can still swap everything. Queen takes, knight takes, and then we have knight f6, recapturing the queen. And we're still going to go to the endgame with this extra pawn. So let's look at bishop g7, right, just to make an example on how to consolidate this advantage. Bishop takes, king takes, and now queen d4 comes with a check. What we're simply going to do is queen to c5, and then start pushing these pawns. So after the check, let's say f6, right? This knight is there to stay forever. And now we're just going to play queen c5. So there's nothing to worry about queen going to e1, because we just go to g2. There is no perpetual. Queen d5, we go to h2. There are no more checks. And we're getting ready to force swaps. Even queen to e7 might be acceptable in this moment, or even queen to c7, winning this pawn. That's also acceptable. And then there's nothing that will be able to allow the black player to stop this majority. And another option would be, like, let's say, for example, queen to d7. Now we play knight to b6. Now, of course, there's like 1 in a million chances that this very end game will happen. But this is just like how, just an idea on how to consolidate the advantage and to preserve this pawn structure. So we're gonna play like knight to b6 now, kicking the queen away. Also, one of the things that we have to remember is that we just don't have to worry about the perpetual. There is one case of perpetual attempt, and we're gonna look at it. So after knight b6 and something like queen d8, one of the many things that have been discussed in this video is that we're desperate for swaps. Right, of course we are, because we have a majority, so of course we are. Queen to c8, if queen were to swap, then we will take this, we'll take the queen back, and we will win the game. Queen d1 check, and now king to g2. Here's the attempt that could happen. So try to remember this sort of pawn structure when the opponent queen is so close to our king. The knight to f4 is a very cheeky attempt. We cannot take this knight, because then we will have this extremely ugly pawn structure, and after queen to g4 we will be in perpetual. So after knight to f4 we just play king to h2, and now the best move, this is the last moves I've played for black are only computer moves. Knight to e2, and now the white player doesn't have to worry, but there's nothing to worry because the white player is able to force a swap. Queen to b7 check first, and then whatever black does we will be able to, let's say black goes to a light square, we can play queen d5, forcing a swap. And if black plays to a dark square, then we will still be able to swap pieces. So even something like queen here, check, and then whatever, king g7, and then we can just swap like this with queen d7. If king goes here, then this is even worse, because after knight to d5, then it's going to be game over very soon.